Welcome to the Public Figure Society podcast, where innovation meets influence. If you're building a brand, leading a movement, or shaping the future, you are in the right place. We bring you the insights, strategies, and stories that fuel the world's most impactful public figures. It is time to step up, stand out, and leave your mark. Let's dive in. We have Jeremy back. Hi, Jeremy. How are you doing?
Hey, Torund.
And why do we have Jeremy back? Well, Jeremy has a lot of expertise, but the one thing that we have been talking quite a bit about lately, for the last couple of months, is The Age of Regenesis, which is a book that Jeremy's going to be coming out with in May. There's going to be a summit on this, and we're going to be, stay tuned, it's going to be very exciting, really about, we have this opportune moment for the next 4 years to define the next 80, and that's what he's going to talk about. And what's really exciting is we both base this on this book called The Fourth Turning is Here with Neil Howe. Highly recommend the book. It's a great framework, not just to understand where we are, but understanding if you're going to be doing investing, if you're planning out your life. It gives a framework on where we are. And that's what Jeremy's here to talk about, is to really talk about the fourth turning, this little pocket we have right now, the age of Regenesis. Once in a lifetime. Most people don't get it in, you don't get it twice, but once in a lifetime you get to experience this moment. And I would just want to say, welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes.
It is the greatest time in world history to be alive. You know, for my whole life, I've heard people say that. You know, we have more technology today than we've ever had. It's the greatest time to be alive. I literally mean it. If you go 50 years in the future, if you get a time machine and go 50 years in the future, you are going to find people that are saying, I wish I could be alive in 2025, 2026, 27, 28, 29, 2030, because this window, this 4 to 6 years, it's truly going to be, it is the most exciting time in world history to be alive, and we get to live it. It's awesome.
So I think for some of listeners, I think a lot of listeners are feeling like we're in the middle of a revolution, and how can we talk about that the next 4 years is going to define the next 80? I think that's it's a very fascinating component, but we both got enlightened at this different times, and we've talked about this quite a bit. So I think you're going to need to take a little step back and tell the listeners, why is it that we think the next 4 years is going to define the next 80, even though we feel like we're right now in the midst of a revolution of some time. Revolution of change is what I call it.
There's not a single person listening right now that will not benefit from what we're going to talk about. I mean, this is absolutely, it is revolutionary. That's the right word. It is a revolution. We are politically living through a revolution. Society as a whole is going through a revolution. And if you look back and you look at previous cycles, they've all been revolutions. And that's why we say, you know, it's once in a lifetime. If we could look back and say, when do I wish I could have been alive? You know, most of us don't spend a lot of time thinking that way. But in my lifetime, you know, as somebody who's spent a lot of time in the investment world, I'm like, man, if I could go back to the 1940s, that'd be an incredible time to be buying stuff and be positioning. You know, we look at healthcare today and we say, well, healthcare is this multi-trillion-dollar industry. Everybody wants to get into it. When did it start? Penicillin didn't come along until the 1940s. That's the beginning of modern healthcare. And that is a good parallel of what we're experiencing right now, that we're at the beginning or the regenesis of the next 80 to 100 year cycle. That the book you referenced there, that's actually the updated book, but the original book was called The Fourth Turning, came out in the 1990s. And what the authors laid out is they laid out these societal cycles that keep going and they keep repeating. And we're in the midst of the beginning of one of those, which is just incredible.
So what I'd love for you to do is, and I think a lot of us will understand it because we've all got these labels on ourselves, you know, the Gen Z, the Gen X, the Zoomers, the silent generation. And so if you could just take us through the season of the fourth turning, which is what they talk about. So it gives people kind of an understanding and also tie the label of that generation, I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just kind of give like a 10-minute overview of the theory, if you will. And, you know, my journey into this was from finance because I spent years studying Elliott wave cycles and conjunctive cycles and all these different financial cycles. And about 2011, 2012, I discovered William Strauss and Neil Howe in their book, The Fourth Turning, which they wrote, I want to say 1994, somewhere in there. They called it an American prophecy. And at that time, we were in the midst of what they referred to as a third turning, which is a high. It's a high of society. And nobody would ever think in 1993 that if you fast forward 20 years in the future, most of our societal structure was going to be crumbling. But we were actually seeing the beginning of it in the early 1990s, and that's what they were talking about. So what they lay out, probably for your listeners, the most parallel cycle would be like the Kondratiev cycle, which is about an 80-year cycle from the Russian economist Nikolai Kondratiev. But what
we're going to put this in the
yeah, we'll put this in
show
the
notes.
yeah,
In
and
the
we'll put
show
it in the
notes.
book too.
Yeah, yeah.
But you know, this 80-year cycle, let me just kind of go through the cycles and explain the fourth turning part. The fourth turning is best parallel to a season. So if we think after spring comes summer, after summer comes fall, after fall comes winter, and that is the fourth season before everything starts over again in the spring. And if we use that as the metaphor, in spring, what happens? We plant new things, and in the summer, it becomes really hard. We work, and then in the fall, we harvest, and then you get to winter, and there's several fascinating characteristics about winter. In the middle of winter, old things die off so that new things can be born. And if there's a theme to capture, that's it. And when we think about it from a society standpoint, it's an institutional dying off. So we're seeing the dying off of established institutions, and it's leaving room for the new variations of those as we move forward. So that's kind of the big picture overview. Is that good? Should I keep going, or you want to?
Yeah, I would love for it to go in because I'd love to just go through the seasons. So we have these seasons, and I think it's really great to create the correlation of the seasons from World War II going back to the Revolution, so people kind of understand that this is not just something that you just have made up, but it actually, what Neil Howe and Strauss did was really show through history. You've got another book called The Pendulum. A lot of them are talking about that history repeats itself, and we hear that I hear that all the time. But I didn't realize that it repeated itself in patterns. And when I discovered this book during COVID, it gave me a sense of comfort knowing I'm in a time when the society is going to break down. We probably have another 5 to 10 years, right? But it helped me mentally prepare myself, because I remember when COVID just happened, I was like, oh, we're just going to have a few weeks and we're going to be back on track. And I remember a friend of mine that actually worked in Europe with this whole component was basically saying, no, Torund, this is going to be 2 to 4 years. And I got so upset, but she was so right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and that when I was feeling that frustration with her, a friend of mine recommended the fourth turning. And then it was like, oh, this is what we're going through. And it gives a sense of comfort, but it also gives you a sense of when to plant, when to sow. And I just thought this was a very, very powerful way of looking in the framework of where you are.
Yeah. The beginning of this fourth turning started with the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And COVID was, I think, the beginning of what they would refer to as a climax, which is kind of where everything is coming to a head. But yeah, it's really drawn out. It's not like it was a 6-month window and this thing is done. And the same thing happened in the previous fourth turning. World War II was the climax of the previous fourth turning. The previous fourth turning started with the 1929 stock market crash. What's referred to as the beginning of the Great Depression. So we had this economic crisis that was happening, but the climax that happened actually didn't happen until World War II. And what happens in the climax is it's a complete destruction of society and a rebuilding. When in that climax moment, society actually is questioning, can we survive? I mean, hello, does that sound anything like the last 4 years? What has the narrative been? The narrative has been, if you follow this politician, then you're going to, fall off the cliff and we'll be in total annihilation. If you follow this politician, you're going to fall off the cliff and be in total annihilation. And in the middle of it, you got a virus that's trying to annihilate everybody. So, it's a fight for your very existence, but that's the scary part. The good part, the beautiful part of this is on the other side, new life comes up. And one of the characteristics of every fourth turning, let's just hit some of the ones in American history. The previous fourth turning it started with the Wall Street
I want
crash.
to interrupt you there. We don't have to call fourth turning. We could just call it winter. Why don't we just call it the seasons of a time?
That's really what it is.
Yeah, why don't we just do that? Because it gets kind of like, I think when I tell people fourth turn, they just look at me. When I say it's winter, and that's what Tony Robbins keeps talking about, that we're in this winter period. I wonder when he's going to talk about spring. But
maybe it will be after we talk about Regenesis.
I don't know. Yeah, but
that's a great point. I was actually kind of thinking that too as you were saying that. Is the thing about winter, people, if you live up north, you may hate the idea of winter because it gets cold. But what do you do in the winter? You can suffer. You can go inside and, try to not freeze to death, or you can bundle up and you can go outside and enjoy winter sports, right?
Right.
There's beauty in every season. And that's the beautiful part of the narrative, is that just because you're in the middle of an economic winter or a societal winter doesn't mean that everything is bad. It just means that things shift.
No, I mean, actually, COVID was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I mean, it completely took all of the expectations away. It puts you down to ground zero, and it makes you think, "Wow, where do I want to go? Where do I want to live? What do I want to do?" Right? And so, I think a lot of people don't really want to admit that publicly because it sounds so bad to say that COVID was the best thing. But that was kind of like my grandmother. My grandmother said the World War II was really nice because the whole community came together. There was a
Bingo.
different way of supporting one another that you didn't experience in peacetime, and it was hard for them to see that leave, right? So I think, yes, there is beauty in all seasons.
And that's one of the fourth turning winter characteristics, is that society at the end comes together. And you're seeing that politically right now, where you have Robert Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard joining with, who they were previously calling the great Satan, Donald Trump. And, everybody's kind of organizing. I was watching an interview with Kid Rock yesterday, and, he was talking about how everybody in his world is Democrat, but they're supporting the Trump agenda because they don't see it as left versus right. They see it as right versus wrong. And they see it as a destruction of big government. They see it as a destruction of, this government force that was supposed to be for us has been working against us. And it just so happens that the leader of that we'll call it the revolutionary movement, that revolution is the Trump MAGA agenda. Are you going to be with it? Or are you going to be against it? It's kind of like, this is where the majority are.
What's interesting is Megyn Kelly had like some people on, and I really liked, because they were all liberals, all like
She's
kind of
a great convert too. Like when you look at the way she was going after him.
I didn't vote for Trump the first round. I was quite upset. I didn't talk to my brother for 6 months when I found out he voted for Trump. So it's not like I was like really upset. But I think there's something about the MAGA 2 movement. There is a movement. So I think the first part was very much one movement, but what a lot of people are saying, and I agree, the second movement, because you weren't just voting for Trump, you were voting for RFK, you were voting for Tulsi, you're voting for the team that's coming in to make a change, and really questioning the corruption and how do we actually operate as a society. So, but you're right, it's coming together, and that is a wonderful thing that you're seeing. Like even with Candace Owens, she's got her show, very much a right-wing person, but she's coming on a social issue, like a Blake Lively and Jason Boldini case, which is really showing how someone was bullying another and so forth. I don't want to go into the issue, but all these liberals saying, "We love you, Candace. I never thought I'd love you as much," and then bringing these forces together. So it's interesting. You're absolutely right. It's becoming more and more prevalent that we're in this season of coming together as a community.
Let me hit really quick on a couple of the winners of the past so your listeners can draw these metaphors, because I think it's so easy when we look at the past to see the pattern, but without seeing the pattern, it's really sometimes hard to project that into the future. So if you look back at our previous winter, it was the stock market crash in 1929. The climax event was World War II. And coming out of that, what did we see? We saw that winter shifted into a spring, and that spring was when all this new stuff began. And that's really the idea of the Regenesis period. Yes, it's true. The post-World War II era is the one that gets all the attention from being this massive growth period. But there was a magic moment in the middle when the war was at its highest point, when everybody came together and they started planting the seeds. They weren't even aware of it. They were planting the seeds of what became the last 80 to 100-year cycle here. If you go back before that, the climax event was the Civil War. That was the previous winter, fourth turning event. And when you come out of that, what did we get? We got the Gilded Era. That's the era that Trump keeps referring to. He's like, this was the greatest time in American history, greatest time of economic growth. Now, his history books refer to it as the Industrial Age. History books refer to it.
So they have an umbrella, the Industrial Age, but the Gilded Age has this little slice of it. So
yes, and that little window of time is what we're looking forward to in about 5 or 6 years. But right now, where we are is we're in that transition. And so what's great about a transition is this is the opportunity to affect the next 100 years. It's incredible, right? If you go to the cycle before that, it was the Revolutionary War. And so when you use the word revolution, it's not a inappropriate term. It's exactly what's happening. Old institutions are dying. The Revolutionary War, it was the monarchy. We're moving towards this new country. We're moving towards this republic. We're moving towards this freedom that the world had never experienced before. You fast forward to the next cycle, it was the abolition of slavery, at least slavery as we knew it, in the transatlantic slave trade. Some would argue that we just shifted into a different form of debt slavery and other things. But, when you look at the cycles of society and how it all shifts, the most recent one, which was the 1930s transition, some new institutions that came along, for example, the Federal Reserve, the IRS came out of that transition, the health industry as we know it, higher education as we know it. And I could go on and on. Global, the whole idea of a global corporation where the corporate structure and the survival of that institution is more important than the individuals that make it up, that's a 20th century ideal. This did not exist before. You couldn't go back into 1870 and everybody said, hey, we're going to fire Bob over here because, we're upside down. And if Bob doesn't go, then the whole corporation is going to fall. So Bob gets the chop. But in the 20th century, that became the ideal. That became the model. We're going to chop the workforce because the institution was more important. And that's the transition we're leading into. And that's what this age of Regenesis is, where all this stuff is transitioning.
It's interesting you say that because I was working with a client that was really working on the Bauhaus movement. The Bauhaus movement came because everything was artisan and beautiful designs, and you weren't like mass production. But how do you create beautiful design in products that are being mass produced? And that's where the Bauhaus came in. And the Bauhaus was this house in Germany where all these designers met, and they said, how do we make ourselves useful again? Because we are losing ourselves in this moment. And yet, if it's going to be mass produced, it still should be created to be something beautiful. And so they created this movement of how to make beauty and mass produce products. And so now you're seeing that movement going back again. It's like, how can we go back to the Bauhaus movement and then create something that has artisan and beauty and won't be the way it was before, but we're redesigning something that's new.
Yeah. I think that's a great metaphor. And one of the things I want to say to your listeners is when you hear this idea that old institutions are dying, it can feel scary because it's unknown, it's uncertain. But what you have to realize is the old institutions were good. They served a purpose, but their cycle has come to an end. Let's go with the cycles of nature theory. In the spring, let's say you plant some seeds, some watermelon seeds, and throughout the entire summer, you nurture those seeds and you harvest your watermelons. At the end of the season, the seeds did their job. They served their purpose, and it's time to turn the soil. It's time for change, and that's what we're moving into now. As much as I hate the Federal Reserve in theory and in principle, there were things that the Federal Reserve did, especially the first 50 years of its existence, that actually did stabilize our economy. But when you look at 2025 and moving forward, it doesn't serve the same way that it did once upon a time. Our health system actually did do some really good stuff over the last 100 years, but it's not serving where we're going now, not the way that it has been serving. And so what's fascinating is people, they hold on to what they know. But it's like my good friend Tony always says, the quality of your life is in direct proportion to the amount of uncertainty that you can learn to comfortably handle. We hold on to that which is certain. But it's in the uncertainty where we discover the new life. And that's the challenge. That's what I want to challenge everybody for this age of Regenesis. Just don't be afraid of it. Embrace it and find out what can you plant, because it's an amazing opportunity.
So I think what I'd love to do now is we've kind of given people the seasons, but could you just tell the seasons from the generations? So then you're basically saying that the baby boomers were spring, right?
Kind of, because they all cross over. I would have to put a chart together to really show you how it all crosses, because inside the big term for the 80-year cycle is called a seculum. And inside the seculum, you have a spring, summer, winter, and fall. Well, individuals come up at different ages in that. So if you look at a human life is on average about 80 years as well. So that means the human has a spring, which is your birth period, and the season coming up to about your coming of age when you're 20. And then your 20 to 40 is kind of that summer season. You're working it really hard. You're defining your identity. And then kind of that 60 to 80, 40 to 60, those are your prime years, right? That's when you're harvesting what your life is. And then kind of the 60 to 80, that's the winter season of life. So some people are born in the spring of the spring, and those were the baby boomers. And so baby boomers were born in that 1945 to 1965 window, which was that previous spring season. So that meant that every cycle of their life has been in the same cycle with this particular turning or this seculum. So, 45 to 65 was their birth, their spring. 65 to 85, which really extended a little bit, but roughly in that range was their summer season. And then 85 to really what went all the way to about 2008 was their harvest, their great harvest. And then 2009 to current, and probably ending around 2029, 2028, roughly in there. That's been their, what are we seeing? We're seeing baby boomers are in their final seasons of life. I mean, my parents, who were quintessential baby boomers, they're 75. They're right there. They're right in that window. But me, I was a Gen X. I was born, my spring season was in 1977 when I was born. So I was born in their summer, my parents' summer. It was societal summer, but it was my spring. And so here I am, I'm in my autumn, and I'm fighting on a societal level. I'm fighting an economic societal winter in my autumn because of the way the seasons and the generations cross. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so we have the boomers, they lived through the spring of, so they're kind of following the seasons in a way.
Very much so.
They're not going contrary to season like we are. So
right.
We're both Gen X. So they're following actually the societal season and their birth season is the same.
Yes.
So they're following the spring, the summer, the fall, and the winter. We, on the hand, who are Gen Xers, are started with our personal spring with the summer of society.
Right. And so when we were coming of age in our 20s, that was the big societal harvest. And it seemed like everything was everything was going great. It was the tech boom. It was all these things, internet coming, cell phones, all this stuff was coming up the way that we know it. And it felt like nothing could go wrong, except for, here's the thing, you look at our generation and the millennials, they get out of college and inflation was so out of control. All these institutions were starting to spin off the plates were spinning too fast, and they weren't keeping up. And so there was this disconnect. We didn't have the same flow that the baby boomer generation had because baby boomers were in a different sync. It's also interesting if you look at social media. I'm sure you've seen this. Have you seen these memes where people are talking about Gen X like we were a different breed?
Right.
Have you seen that? Because we were left alone, and we used to put out cigarettes on the tongue to impress people, like all this crazy stuff that Gen Xers used to do. It's actually, it fits in that model because that society, the children of the baby boomers, are considered kind of a forgotten nomad generation where we didn't have the oversight that so many others had. Our parents were trying to figure it all out themselves. But the counter movement to that, and this is what everything is, it's moves and counter moves. The counter movement to that is our generation, Gen Xers, are overly parenting their kids. While our parents were overly loose, our kids become overly parented. We're the most homeschooled generation in history, except for maybe preschool completely. But, we have all these like really, I rode my bike on major not interstates, but major highways with no helmet when I was a kid. Right. We won't let our kids ride their bikes around the neighborhood without a helmet and knee pads, right? It's that kind of a reaction that the different generations have.
Right, and then you have the millennials, and then you have Gen Z. And then, so basically you're saying there was a Gen X in the previous seculum.
Yes. I'd have to go back and look at it, but
that's interesting.
In the book, they lay it all out.
Right, so that's what's really fascinating is, so we're not as special as we think. There was a generation 180 years ago that was just like us.
It's just like King Solomon always said, there's nothing new under the sun.
So I would love for us to take the latter part of the podcast is to talk about what can we expect now and how should we sow in this time that's really, or prepare for sowing is really what it is. It's really preparing to set the seeds. Maybe it's mental mindset. I don't, that I would love for you to go into what are you envisioning the next 4 years are that are actually defining the next 80?
So the number one thing that I want everybody that's listening and everybody I talk to, what I want everybody to get is this is an amazing time. I mean, it genuinely is the time in history when people in the future will say, I wish I could go back to that time. So rather than getting so frustrated, so angry about it, you can find everything that's going wrong because there's plenty of stuff that's going wrong, but you can also find what's going right. So, the first thing is just stay grounded, get grounded and realize better days are coming. If you look at, we're recording this in February, winter's almost over. Like where I live in Nashville, we start baseball in 2 weeks, right? I mean, our baseball season, have games. And winter's almost over, spring is almost here. And society-wise, winter is almost over. Trump keeps calling it the golden age. I think it's a really, really great name for it. Capture that. Instead of resisting, if your listeners have been resisting MAGA and they've been resisting Trump, realize what's happening. You actually can't stop it. Your resistance to MAGA is only going to make it more annoying to you. Join it. And I'm not saying that because I'm a MAGA fanatic. I'm saying it because from a cycle standpoint, this is where society is going. You're either going to join it or you're just going to be full of anger in the process. So let it go.
Think what's interesting, I think what's an interesting note though is that even if Trump hadn't won, society would still fall apart in a different way. So it's not like it's MAGA itself that you're really supporting in a way, but you're really supporting there is a new societal change. And if you want to get on the bandwagon, you're going to want to accept where things are and start thinking about how do I define the next 80 for my family, my legacy, my business, and society, correct?
It doesn't matter who the leader is, and it doesn't matter what the name is. This was going to happen. Society was going to come together and say, no, we've had enough taxes. No, big government has taken too much advantage of us. The American people were going to come together and unify. It just so happened that the figurehead for that was Donald J. Trump. Yeah. It just so happened the name that they applied to it was MAGA because it was an acronym for his slogan, Make America Great Again. That just so happened. You can't get mad at the people that are in charge. They're the leaders for the time. And as I think you and I have talked about, I can't remember if we said it on a previous podcast, I genuinely believe the Bible when it says that God has appointed the leaders. So, okay, if these are the leaders, I may disagree with them, and there's plenty I disagree with, but I'm going to honor it, and I'm going to trust that at the end of the day, Earth is going to go through whatever cycle it's going to go through.
But it's like working within your framework. So let's go back to the Regenesis then. So if all of society is going to change, so in the next episode, we're going to talk about how the society is going to change for the public figure society because we're coming to an end on this one. But like what are the general themes that we should look at? How should we think about ourselves? Yes, we have the mindset that things are going to be changing. What are some signs we should look at? These 4 years now, they're going to go fast.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw out my favorite one that most people would not realize. Fear. The moment you feel fear, remember two things. Number one, it's not from God because God's not the author of fear. And number two, the moment you feel fear, realize that it's your emotions and your body reacting to the unknown. That is the opportunity. All of your opportunity is in that moment. So if you're looking at the banking system and you say, I feel fear, stop for a moment, breathe, and say, wait a second. That means that there's something greater here for me to find. And if you can look at every institution that we have been so comfortable with for the last 100 years. And whenever I start talking about it, if I start talking about healthcare is going to change, my mom, who's a nurse for 45 years, she gets fear. Why? Because it's the unknown. Doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean that Robert Kennedy's message of Make America Healthy Again is bad. It just means that it's different. And when you look at government, we're going to get rid of USAID. We're going to get rid of all of this idea that the United States is funding Europe and all these different, countries around the world. Oh no, what are we going to do? Who's going to have their aid? That's your fear because you're so indoctrinated to it. Oh, we're going to get rid of the IRS. Oh no, how are we going to fund the government? I promise it's all going to work out. This too shall pass. Might feel like kidney stones, but it's going to pass.
But what can we, so yes, the society, so we're seeing the tea leaves. One thing we're seeing is AI is coming more and more in. So I
Yep.
guess one way of preparing for the next 4 years is really to hone in on understanding AI, understanding how it can operate with your life. But and I know that you're talking about mindset, but how do you, when you're seeing something falling, how do you prepare yourself for sowing the seeds?
Well, the reason I talk about the mindset piece is because that's the first tea leaf. The first place you know something is changing is emotionally. Your emotions will have a visceral reaction against it. So that's why I mentioned that. But there's
Okay.
about 8 or 10 industries that I've recognized and I've identified that are shifting. Government's one of them. We're moving from big government. We're going to see a regenesis of small government that may even be smaller possibly than the original government in 1776. Like, we are going to go so far, and it's a pendulum swing. There's nothing you can do about it. We went so big and so out of control that we're going to be back to what libertarians have, drooled about for the last 30 years. That's one institution. The healthcare industry is another institution that's going to be changing. AI it's a tool, but it's not the change itself. Let's look at finance, because everybody understands finance better than AI. The Federal Reserve is a institution that was established in 1913, and it really found its home in the Great Depression. That's when everybody was like, okay, we're going to accept the Federal Reserve, the central banking idea. Now, it wasn't the first central bank, but it was the one that took over for the last 100 years. What we're seeing right now, the seeds were planted in 2009. It's called Bitcoin. It's called blockchain. Blockchain technology has been building its momentum, and we are seeing it right now, bursting on the scene. And what you're going to see replace the Federal Reserve, I think, is a treasury. In the Treasury Department, it will be a variation of central banking that is all blockchain, and it's all DeFi, which is decentralized finance. Now, for your listeners who may not know what that means, it's a decentralized, autonomous organization. It's running essentially on its own without human intervention. That's a variation of AI. It's not AI itself, but it's this idea that we're setting the parameters and we're going to let it run. People who've been resisting crypto don't realize that crypto is your savior. It is the antidote to the Federal Reserve. And that's what you're going to see in industry after industry. The anecdote shows up. It's just the pendulum swinging to a different direction.
Oh, that's interesting. So, what we should recognize is when we find the fear, or if the fear comes upon us, is to realize it's just a reaction to the unknown, which I really like. Fear is a reaction to the unknown, and in that unknown, sit still and just figure out what to do step by step, because we don't know what the steps are going to be. And I think
Yeah.
this is we're sailing in uncharted waters, but you still want to go towards a direction, right?
There's a lot of things that we can see, and there's a lot of things. The thing about the unknown, people don't realize this. The unknown is absolutely full of failure, but it's good failure. Thomas Edison, they say he failed 10,000, 15,000 times before he created the light bulb. But every one of those failures, every one of those is a stepping stone towards your ultimate success. So part of the last 100 years is we were rewarded for perfection. We were rewarded for never making a mistake. And people have this idea that if I make a mistake, I'm a failure. No, failure is actually the greatest gift, because you learn what didn't work. And in this season of Regenesis, there's all these seeds that have to get planted, just to stick with that metaphor. You're just throwing seeds out, and a bunch of them will not germinate. It's like the old parable says, a third of the seed falls on rocky ground and nothing happens. A third of it falls and it takes root, but the birds come and get it. And then there's a third of the seed that actually falls in ground, and you can, actually harvest that. And that's the way this Regenesis is. We're going to have to just be throwing seeds. AI is a reaction in the same way that 100 years ago, the workforce was a reaction to this agrarian society moving towards this industrial age. And that industrial age needed to scale. That was how do we do it? Well, we create the institutions, we train them. Now we have this workforce. AI is a reaction to that. So you're not going to lose your job to an AI. You're going to lose your job to people who are running AI. AI is doing all these low-level jobs that it can do now in automation. So it's one of the many, many tools and technologies that's coming into place.
Wow, that's a great place to end, because we'll have part two. Because that's exactly what it is. So, what seeds do we plant in as a person with public figure, which is what I am, public figure society, which is what this podcast is called. So we're going to go. We invite you to part two. Also, Jeremy's going to be doing a series on the Regenesis that's going to be coming on his podcast, Think Rich Radio, which we will also put into the links. So you can follow it there in more depth, because he will, what I'm passionate about is I'm passionate about one vertical of this, which is the public figure society, us personally. How do we deal with it? He is dealing with it in all the institutions. And what's really exciting is this book is going to be coming out in May, where we're going through all of the various societal changes that we see possibly happening. And so stay tuned for next one. Thank you for listening to the Public Figure Society podcast, where innovation meets influence. If you love this episode, be sure to subscribe, follow, and leave a review. Connect with us on social media and join the conversation. Until next time, keep innovating, keep influencing, and we'll see you in the next episode.